Hi, my name is Renford Reese. I am the founder and director of the Prison Education Project and the Reintegration Academy for Parolees. We're here today as a part of the Prison Race series to have a candid discussion with Mr. Michael O'Brien about his entanglement in the criminal justice system. I think he was in the system for about 27 years. I want to talk to him about his past, his present, and his future. Michael, good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Dr. Reese.
Can you tell us something about your background? How did you grow up?
Well, I'm originally from St. Louis. My mother, she was 14 years old when I was born. And so basically my first years I spent with my grandparents. And when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I was brought to California because one of my aunts had died and she had 2 children. So I was brought to California to live with my mother, who had since that time had several other children. And when the first place that I lived in California was in Aliso Village. Okay, and so that's where it started. And my mother and her husband and my siblings. I ultimately, at the end, had 5 sisters and a brother, but we lived as a family throughout that period.
Okay, what type of student were you?
Well, actually, I was a pretty good student when I was a student. But it was just about a question of when I was going to be a student or when I wasn't. Sometimes I had distractions, and so the distractions would take me away from school. But generally, whenever I focused, I usually did pretty good.
What were the distractions?
Well, like now you see all the TV programs about bullying and kids picking on kids and stuff like this. Well, back then they didn't really have that, and that people really didn't have the things in place to kind of deal with some of those issues. And so what happened was, I don't know, maybe because I wasn't from the area, maybe because I looked different from some people, maybe because I had a big head. Some kids would like to pick on me. And so what would happen is that there came a point to where I decided that that was something that was unacceptable. And from that point on, then what I did is I took a more aggressive posture to address those issues.
So you were picked on until what, 12 years old, 13 years old?
Maybe 3rd, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade.
You were bullied?
Yeah, bullying was a big factor in my life. You see, in California, the gangs have always played a big role. And if you lived in an area where the gangs dominated, then if you were not a part of the gangs or those groups, then what happened was you became, you were more or less prey. And so sometimes in the response to being prey, you yourself become the predator.
Right. What high school did you go to?
Well, I attended Susan Miller Dorsey High School.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was that experience like? Were you involved in student council, band, sports, any type of clubs?
Actually, when I attended high school, I ran cross-country track the first year. But in my second year, I moved back to St. Louis, where I attended high school at Northwest High School, and this is in St. Louis, Missouri. And then I returned to Los Angeles for the 3rd year and my final year. And I completed my last classes at the continuation school, which is attached to Susan Miller Dorsey. And what had happened was, at that time, because I graduated in 1975, which was the year that I was supposed to graduate, but the principal at Susan Miller Dorsey High School, he wouldn't put me through the graduation process because I was short 2 classes, and he wanted me to take the classes over the summer. And what I did was I'd found this out 3 or 4 weeks prior to graduation, and I went to the night school and signed up and took the classes where you worked more or less independent study, and I completed them. And so he didn't want me to walk the stage unless I took the classes over the summer. And so what I did was I just graduated with the adult school, and I ended up graduating from Crenshaw Dorsey Community Adult School, June 4th, 1975.
So when did it start to turn? How did you become entangled in the criminal justice system?
Well, my first involvement with the criminal justice system was actually me responding to some pressures that had been put upon me by some of the gangs in the community that I lived in. And what would happen is that the way I would respond to the group is I would just wait until I would catch them by themselves, and then I would physically address the issue however I felt it was appropriate. Well, I'd had a group of guys that had kind of tried to rough me up one day, and so I saw one some days later. And when I saw him, I approached him about what they had did to me. And so we ended up in a fight, and he kind of didn't do very well in the fight. But what he did is he ran, and some people grabbed him to help him, because I was chasing him. I was pretty angry at the time, you know, and it was a sense of frustration. And I felt personally that the only way that I was going to address the issues was to be as aggressive on my own as they were in a group. And so what happened was the people got him, and so he said that I attempted to rob him, which was a lie. And so what happened is I was arrested sometimes later, and then my parents, because they were kind of ignorant of the law, instead of getting an attorney, which they didn't really have money for that at the time, what they did is they more or less suggested that I accept a plea bargain for probation at 16 years old. And so that was the beginning. And just, you know, later on, as time went on, things seemed to spiral forward. And, you know, basically what it was is sometimes you find a way of addressing problems that are taking place in your life, and the way that you address them isn't necessarily the way that is most acceptable. And what I found is that while I probably should have addressed issues in many of the same ways that the people who were being aggressive towards me ultimately addressed them, and that probably would have changed the course somewhat. But with some of the stigma that went behind things like telling on people, you know, you're a snitch or you're this or you're that, those were things that I didn't choose to do at that time. You know, I hadn't fully, at that time, thought through my options. And so what I did is I acted just on instinct. And my instinct is to give back whatever I got. And so what it did was it kind of put me in a culture of violence, to where violence became something that was acceptable for me. And so what I did is I embraced that because it worked for me, and it worked really well. And so then, as time went on, you know, I chose to use the violence in different ways. And then ultimately, I end up going to prison and spending 27 years of my life.
So tell us about prison. What was it like when you first went into prison?
Well, when I first went into prison, it was kind of scary at first.
How old were you?
Well, when I first went to prison, I was 21, but it was for a very short period of time. Okay, and I got out. The initial experience was a scary experience, but yet it was an experience that, in a sense, somehow tended to affirm the ideas that I had in my head that, you know, that you take care of things the way you need to take care of them. Okay, because in prison, that was what was acceptable with the people. If you were strong, then what would happen is the people would respect that. If you were willing to use violence as a means to solve your problems, the people would accept that. I mean, once you commit one or two violent acts, you don't have to do anything else, because people will spread that. And that spreads, and so that causes people to respect you and to feel comfortable with you, because they say you down, or you're this, or, you know, you stand up. Now, that was the initial experience. And so, as I said, it more or less affirmed what some of my ideas were. Now, at that time, seemingly, I should have been a lot smarter than I was, and I should have been moving away from that. But I wasn't, and I stayed on that path. So now, when I get out, and I ended up ultimately getting back in trouble and going back to prison when I was 28 years old, and spending 27 years until I was 55. What happened was when I went to prison the second time, that I had people that embraced me. And they said, hey man, look, you got time to do, and it's a couple of ways that you can do it. You can do it in a way that is detrimental to you, and that will be hard for you to get through it, at least getting through it with some sense, or you can do it in a way that is going to help you to move forward as a human being and maybe even transform your life. And so at that early stage, what I did is I started working to transform my life. I remember that when I was arrested in St. Louis, Missouri, this was November 25th, 1985, almost 28 years ago to the day right now. I'd had a time where you go through the process of being booked in, a very dehumanizing process. And it seems like they can never find clothes that fit you right. And they had given me a jumpsuit that was kind of like a little too small, and they gave me a little piece of a blanket that I had to use to cover up, and a big pillow to put the mattress in. And so after I had more or less gotten booked in and I had gotten into the cell, and I kind of knew I was in trouble, I knew I had some problems, and I went to sleep. And so in there are lights that go on 24/7. And so I woke up sometimes later. I don't even know how long it was. It may have been 2 or 3 hours or 5 or 6 hours. I have no idea, because the light is always the same. But when I woke up, it was like a moment that I was spending with myself. And, we all have these moments. We have them at different times in different places. Sometimes you can be with somebody else and you can have that moment. But it was a moment that I was having with myself where I realized that, I had to make some changes in my life, or else basically it was going to be a wrap. That prison was going to be the only legacy that I would ever have. And so when I entered into the prison system, after having come to that realization, this is when I attracted to me the kind of people that would encourage me and help me to move down another path. And so I started there, and I just continued to build. It was an everyday building process. And for me, what my goal was to learn something new and transformative every day, no matter how small it was. Because I felt that as long as I was learning and moving forward, that what would happen is that I wouldn't stagnate and move backwards. You see, you can never stay in the same place for a long time. And if you try, it just gets sour and you eventually rot and you decay. But if you're constantly moving forward and growing, then what happens is you'll thrive wherever you are. It doesn't matter what environment they put you in, you will thrive. And so that was my goal. And so during my time in prison, I saw many people fall by the wayside. I saw many people just give up on life, because prison is a very dehumanizing experience. Okay, and sometimes we do things and we can't stand the power of the retribution that comes. Sometimes, men, they just aren't strong enough. Sometimes you dig a ditch and you can't climb out of it. And this was the case. But, I always, throughout this entire experience, I just remained hopeful that if I could stay the course and just stay focused and try to do good things, try to help people not be victimized by other prisoners, try to help people to see that, they don't necessarily have to be locked into the present course that they're on.
Okay, if I can ask you a question, do you think the system, the criminal justice system, the prison system, is one, exploitative, and two, corrupt?
Oh, of course it is, on both points. Number one, everything that happens in prison is about money. When they give you clothes, is about money. When they mark up the prices in the canteen, it's about money. It's about profit. When they have you work for sub-slave wages, it's about profit.
Telephone calls.
When you call your family, it's really about profit. Okay? Like $15 for 15 minutes. Where on the planet do they do that? But in prison. And so when you go to the visiting room, it's about money. Everything is about money. And it's exploitative because what they do is they create an environment that makes it very difficult for the individual to thrive or move away from the behaviors that got him to prison. And so when I say that, what I mean is that if a guy comes into prison and he's serving a couple of years and he has a drug problem and he spends a couple of years in prison and they won't get him help, then what they're doing is they're saying, you know what, you don't need help. We're going to send you right back out to do what you do. And I watch this time and time and time again. Guys come in, they have problems, and they don't sometimes know how to address the problems themselves. And then the prison, rather than providing the resources that are needed so that they can receive help, or making sure that they receive help that is serious and adequate help, like some of the programs that they do have, they'll put people in the programs that don't want to be there, that reject the programs, and then you'll have people who are trying to get in the programs that they won't even allow in the programs. The people who need the help can't get the help. The people who don't want the help, they force the help on because they reject it. And so what happens is that it creates an environment where the people go through a cycle, and they just keep feeding back into it.
Let me give you a hypothetical scenario. What if you were the warden of a prison that had, let's say, 1,000 inmates? What type of changes would you make? What would be your, let's say, your formula inside of this prison?
Well, you know, this is a question that I thought about and had discussion about with a few people. And I used to work while in prison. I had volunteered to work on what they called a super circle. And in the super circle, it was comprised of several inmates and several high-level staff. And what they did is they worked to try to make the environment a much better environment, you know, a more productive environment. Some of the things that I personally would focus on is I think that people need the opportunity to be responsible for themselves. And I would look at things like trying to bring private industry in to provide jobs and getting people into the habit of paying bills and doing the things that normal people do. Because in prison, what happens is they create a dynamic where people become dependent. And they become so dependent that they want to get out of prison and continue that dependency. And when you get out of prison, you can't continue being dependent. You have to become independent. And so what happens is you have guys that they get out of prison and they want to get SSI or disability, or they want to get general relief. And they sit in prison and they think of ways to get these things which keep them in a dependent state. So what I would focus on is trying to get people into the habit of being independent, providing them with opportunities where they can earn money which they would have to use a portion of to pay for their stay in prison, maybe the education they receive while in prison, but nevertheless to earn money and then to be able to save money so that when they get out, they would feel more independent. Okay, because when a guy gets out of prison with $200 in his pocket and you let him go in any city, United States of America, and then you assign him a parole agent that has no means of providing him any type of support or help in that process, what do you really expect him to do? So if we work with people and help them to become independent, put them in a position where they can make good choices and see how good it feels to make good choices, then what happens is we start to send people out of prison that will become productive citizens over time, because they will have seen that when they do certain things, they receive certain things. Okay, it's
positive reinforcement.
Absolutely, positive reinforcement. Right. And so, I would try to, it's about, I believe it's about education.
Speaking of education, you got degrees while you were inside.
Yeah, I have a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and I have a paralegal diploma from Blackstone. Blackstone was a correspondence course that I took. The University of Missouri, at the time that I went to prison in Missouri, they brought professors into the university, into the prison to teach the classes. And so in conjunction with St. Louis Community College and the University of Missouri, a lot of guys were really able to get degrees, and many of whom have gotten out and become very successful. I have this, I just want to just mention this. I have a friend who lives in St. Louis. His name is Harry. And Harry got out in 1991 after having spent 19 years in prison. I recently talked to Harry, and Harry has had the same job that he had since 1991. And he works with helping guys who are getting out of prison get jobs and get a place to stay, helping them to become independent. And a lot of guys that were getting that education, they talked about the kind of things that they wanted to do when they got out that were productive, versus the guys that didn't choose to get education, or who were there and just choose to live their lives as they had lived them before coming to prison, because this was just one more stop for them and they probably planned to make many more.
Speaking of education, tell us about the impact of the Prison Education Project. You were involved in it at CRC Norco.
I think that the Prison Education Project was an excellent idea. Number one, because California prisons, while it says California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, they really haven't gotten up to speed on the rehabilitation part. And prior to making that change, they had spent many years just being retribution, just making people pay, killing programs throughout the system. But what the program does is it provides guys a chance to see what type of options are available to them. It gives them a chance to go in and experience a setting where they sit in a class and someone's there and they're sharing with them on the same level that they might be sharing with them if they were in a university class. And so what that does is it puts the guys in a position to see that this is something that they might can do.
Right. Now, you've been out for a couple of months. If you could just summarize what it's been like since you've paroled.
Well, it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle because really I believe that especially for high-risk parolees, that they haven't put things into place to assist them in making that transition. And the things that they have in place are basically horrible. But for me, I came out, I lived in a motel for 7 months in Orange County, and I don't have a single family member. I didn't even know a single person in Orange County when I got there. So for 7 months, I lived in a motel room. And at times, I worked a minimum wage job just to pay my rent, but I paid it. And so eventually I moved to Long Beach, where I got a better job. And so I got my own place, nice place, I might add. But it's been a process. And the process has been, it's been a learning process for me, really. Because when I left prison, I wanted to come out and I wanted to somehow become involved in the Reintegration Academy, you know, as a facilitator helping, because I did a lot of that work while in prison. But after having gone through my experience, what I realized is that experience provided me with some of the tools that I'm actually going to need should that opportunity present itself to me. Because now I have the hands-on experience of getting out, going through the process. I know what it's like to take a job where you're making less money than you feel you should earn. I know what it's like to try to make it off minimum wage, because I made it off minimum wage. Okay? I know what it's like to be in a city where you don't even know how to get from point A to B. Okay? I remember one time I had to spread a map out on my bed just to find out where I was.
Mike, I want to thank you for coming in. You have an inspirational story, and I think you have a lot to give, so much wisdom, so much knowledge, and I look forward to working with you in the near future. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me. Okay.